Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this radio audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about a subject that I think is fascinating, but one that we're not allowed to talk about anymore. It's effectively out of bounds to even mention or discuss it, but intrepid as I am, I'm going to go through with here in this essay. And that is why when, say, 10, 20,000 years ago, every human on the planet lived in the Stone Age. Technologically, everybody was about the same. Now, you can say there were differences maybe based on climate and how people organised getting something to eat in say, a colder climate versus a warmer climate, or close to a fertile river valley versus frozen wastelands, so there were differences in that sort of thing, which would have created different adaptations and organizational sort of responses to the environment. But nonetheless, everybody lived in the Stone Age. Now, there's debate as to whether or not the Stone Age ended 10,000 years ago, 12,000, 20,000. But that's academic for the purpose of this essay. Everybody, no matter which point in time you want to select, everybody was on the same level. Everybody was in the fucking Stone Age. And then things started to change, as in, the Bronze Age and the Iron Age and all that sort of thing. So different races or civilizational groupings, call it what you like, adapted, or not so much adapted, developed technically or technologically along different lines. Now, there were various catalysts to this. I haven't read what I think is a satisfactory explanation for it all. Sure, they've raised some interesting questions and made some interesting points, various authors and writers, but to me, that bigger picture of how it happened hasn't really been put together, or not that I've found yet, or to my satisfaction at least. But what can be beyond dispute is that different civilizational groupings advanced at different ways technically. Now, once they advanced to a certain point technically, particularly with agricultural and that sort of thing, the circumstances had to be there, like the fertile river valleys of the Tigris River, the Euphrates River, the Nile, of course, being a big play, the Yangtze River in China, and so on. So wherever there were large river valleys or rivers that were delivering fertile, large areas of loam and fertile fields for cultivating, you would tend to get more people coming in. They had better diets, more plentiful food, therefore they reproduced more. And once they reproduced more, you then had to produce organizational structures for managing it, things like dispute resolution through courts, or all sorts of sort of social structural apparatus began to come out of that. And then other ways of looking for various efficiencies. Let's get more land under cultivation, or now we have to cut irrigation channels. How can we do that? That then various technologies came from those sorts of things, and on it went. So there were circumstantial and geographical differences, again, fertile river valleys versus, say, Northern Europe, that was, at that stage anyway, frozen over for 6 to 8 months of the year. So there were different adaptations, responses to environment there. So the first technological advances were made, organizational and technological, were really made in those fertile regions. We're going back, of course, thousands of years now. There were some changes where, say, with ancient Greece and certainly ancient Rome, where organizational and technological issues began to not so much supersede agriculture. Agriculture is still a huge part, but began to supersede these other things and really have equal billing. Whereas to have a fertile area for agriculture, that was really the big play. But then as technology as it was at the time, remember the Romans invented concrete. If you look at the Greeks, Pythagoras and those guys, we're talking 550 BC. So we're talking 2600, 2700 years ago. Pythagoras was developing mathematical theories, which are still being taught today, for goodness sakes. So technology and intellectual property, if you like, began to have equal billing with agriculture. But really, the genesis of organisation and the technology around it began around the river valleys, justifiably and understandably so, where you can concentrate populations and use the skills of the people and the knowledge of the people and so on. Building the pyramids, that was a huge civil engineering undertaking, and even by today's standards is quite impressive. Without the Nile River being there, though, or indeed the Tigris and the Euphrates and Baghdad and all that, those places wouldn't have existed either. So that was pretty much essential to it. Not that big river valleys became irrelevant, not only for things like providing agriculture and irrigation, but also navigation. Getting around was a tough gig in those days. So, it was just to give you an idea, even in the 1700s, it was quicker to sail or circumnavigate the British Isles on a ship. It was quicker to do that than it was to try and take a horse and cart across England from east to west or west to east. So that's how difficult roads were. The roads were piss poor, unusable during bad weather, and the likelihood that your cart would break its wheels and so, this sort of thing. And there are only a very limited number of serviceable highways. You had to pay lots of money to use, so it was cheaper and quicker to do it in a ship. That sounds insane today, but there you go. Something that could be done, travel east to west today in a few hours, would take a few weeks back then. So river navigation was a big. So if you had a river you could navigate, then that was a big deal. Now, as the ice sheets retreated, the mini ice age retreated, then Northern Europe started to. The rivers there were able to be used sort of more often. The Rhine River, the Rhone River, and various other rivers in, for example, England and so on. But I have to remember that even up until the later Middle Ages, the population of England was like 2 million people. Even in the late 1700s, the population of France was 26, 27 million, whereas the population of England was like 8 million. So that'll give you an idea of the relativity of large rivers and the amount of fertile ground, the weather, and so on. Now, why did certain civilizations, even though they had access to large rivers, and why did certain civilizations not advance at the same rate or a similar rate, or even a partial rate? For example, the Phoenicians in about 800 BC, so 3,000 years or so ago, were in the Iron Age, so they were smelting iron for various tools, weapons, that sort of thing. And one of the interesting things when the white people started penetrating, the interior of Africa, was that they found the most advanced Black African civilization still had not reached the Iron Age of 3,000 years previously, and the technology they had been picked up from the Arabs anyway. It wasn't something they developed. But when they went outside of Black communities or civilizations that had not had, away from the coast, that did not have access to the Arab or no exposure to the Arabs, they were still living in the Stone Age. And the same goes for the Australian Aborigines, still living in the Stone Age. How is it possible that a civilization can exist for 20,000 years, really frozen in time? The development of tools or technology or whatever from 20,000 years previously to the current day being, say, the late 1700s, when they were getting early 1800s, when they were encountering the advanced Western civilizations. How can you stay in the one spot for 20,000 years? Is it even possible? if we accept, well, there's nothing wrong with that, fine, you stay in. Why is it that other civilizations didn't develop? Why didn't they stay in the Stone Age? So we're all one, we're all equal, all Stone Age, and then it suddenly starts to branch out and go in different directions. Now there was still sort of there was a lot of prime agricultural land in Australia. Why did the local Aborigines not sort of cultivate that and have large farms and agricultural situations as they did in the Nile River Valley or the Yangtze River in China or the Euphrates River in the Middle East and so on? And why did those things not develop along the same lines? Why, for example, did the development in England of because there were a lot of, not huge rivers necessarily, but a lot of decent rivers around England, why did they not develop agriculture on a similar scale to in the Middle? Now in the Middle East, it's a little bit different. You can run close to all, maybe not all year round, but most year round crops and different crops at different times. You have multiple crops, whereas in Europe and the colder seasonal climates, you really only have a couple of bites at it, whereas you can get 4 or 5 bites at it in as in producing a crop annually. As you do in the other areas. So even if you're using crop rotation in Northern Europe, you still can't. The growing season still isn't that long, and you can't produce the quantity that you can produce in the better climates. So in areas where they couldn't produce all year round crops, for example, then they advanced technically at a faster rate, and we see this in ancient Greece. And ancient Greece is hardly it's very rocky and mountainous, so it's hardly an area for mass cultivation. I mean, they did crops and olives and olive oil. I mean, they did all that sort of stuff, but not to the same degree. So, but why did they develop technically? Why did other societies, say African societies, where they didn't have maybe the same amount of agricultural opportunities and rivers and fertile areas, why didn't they produce? Why didn't they advance along technical or technological lines? So we've still got the various questions to ask here. Why did the ancient Greeks, for example, understand that, well, we can't play in that sort of league agriculturally, so we'll develop technically. So they developed the most advanced ships for trading at the time. Mathematical theories, engineering, the buildings that they built. The ancient Greeks, the Athenians in particular, were quite advanced in the day for mining. They were big players in the silver mining game, so they had developed a number of technologies, if you like, to be able to go mining, pump out. The Romans produced quite advanced pumping systems for mining, along with many other technologies. Archimedes being a big player in some of those technological developments. But we're looking at where really a very limited number of civilizations decided to go down the technical path. Most were looking at just agricultural type pursuits, and nor was that agricultural pursuits. They still was front and center for many hundreds of years, sort of thereafter. In fact, into really until the Industrial Revolution came along. So the question still comes: why did certain societies develop along certain lines? And then as the level, the amount of technology developed, we need to sort of come to grips with something that's quite astonishing. The West went from horse and cart in terms of road transport. There was steam trains by then. Went from horse and cart as the main form of road transport, indeed the only form of road transport. Went from that to landing a man on the moon in 70 odd years. A 70-year timeline from horse and cart to landing a man on the moon. I mean, holy fuck. So again, why do some societies develop along civilizational groupings along particular lines and others? Why do some advance very quickly then suddenly stop? For example, medieval Baghdad and the Middle East around there, right in the heart of Islam, they had some of the finest libraries and centers of learning in the whole world, say 1200 AD. And they were the envy of the world. Visitors from, say, medieval Britain, for example, would go there in awe and wonder at these huge libraries, how all the brightest folks in the world were gathering there as lecturers and scholars and researchers and so on. And then suddenly that all stopped. Suddenly, the Islamic world you're looking at the Genghis Khans and the Mongols, wreaking havoc around there. You're getting that, but for some reason it all came to like a shuddering halt, and they were then frozen in time, barely advancing at all beyond the place they're in. In fact, if it hadn't been for the travellers coming back from China through the Silk Road, they probably would have never discovered gunpowder and things like that, or saltpeter being the primary, which occurs on the surface and along the Silk Road, which is how it was discovered. So I'm sort of open. I'd be interested in seeing your comments there. But certain societies advanced at a rapid rate technically, and whichever civilizational grouping was the most technically advanced would be in an obviously advantageous position. And since the scientific Enlightenment period, that's been exclusively the domain of really the Western world, the white Western world, which has been reflected in the most advanced technology, the most advanced manufacturing, the most advanced, everything, and which is why wealth has accumulated, disproportionately to the most advanced societies, as by the way it has throughout time and throughout history. That's certainly no different. So this is an interesting one, that everybody was equal all those years ago, and then it changed, and different rates of growth and development, and growth, wealth, development, all these sort of things are relative rather than absolute. For example, Britain was the richest country in the world in 1890. Now Britain is infinitely richer today than it was in 1890, but it's now the 6th or 7th largest economy in the world. So it's gone from number 1 to number 7, even though it's much richer than it was when it was number 1. But what happened is other countries past Britain, they were more productive, more innovative, produced more efficiently, were better organized, and so on and so forth. So societies were, different civilizational groupings are moving at different speeds, if you like, in terms of technical and organizational development, and at different times in history. Why did the Romans go from the premier, without peer, the premier developers of new technology and innovative engineering? Why did they go from that to just suddenly come to a shuddering halt around 400 or so AD, and they couldn't seem to come up with anything new or innovative or clever or whatever for at all, from that point onwards. Why in the Middle Ages were there so few new development? Not that there weren't any, there were, and there were some structural developments. For example, the flying buttresses in the big cathedrals in order to sustain the high roof and the tall buildings. So, those were innovations. But the innovations, although not completely absent, suddenly slowed down, and for a long time. And then around the later Middle Ages and the Enlightenment, it suddenly picked up and really moved quick. Why are those things happening, or why do some societies embrace that and not others? What are the various catalysts and sub-catalysts that go into that? And I don't know if I've ever seen a satisfactory explanation to it all. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.